Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, it's pretty insane. Okay, we'll get started. Make sure everything can flow normally. So welcome to the .NET user group. Thanks for coming, everybody. There's Oreos in the front. If you want anything, just let me know. But tonight we're going to be talking about MCP servers. So how many people have heard of MCP servers? I imagine majority of you. A couple of you have not. Okay. So we're going to be talking about how to actually integrate them. We had a previous .NET user group talk about developing them and using the SDK that when it was in version 0.1 in preview. But we're going to just be talking about how to actually use them in deployed places and just talking through a little bit more about what use cases they might have and just getting more into MCP servers. So if you have any questions, please stop me. We'll discuss as we go along. But yeah, we'll just get started. Oh, there it goes. So there is, I wrote a little template for myself because I kept having to spin up boilerplate stuff. So I'm using Aspire, plug Aspire because Aspire is awesome. But you can use that repo. It spins up a MCP server with a client and goes through kind of the ways that we're going to talk about, but if you're interested. But the biggest thing that MCP servers now expose to everyone is that it's a security problem. There was a couple big attacks, but basically, for some reason, we saw AI and said, oh, all those software things we've been talking about, and those architecture problems and principles that we've been having for years, let's throw that out the window. Give them unauthenticated access to our databases. Give them access to our APIs, and let them just run. But so a couple key points here. MCPs are really a new attack surface for people because prompt injection, right? There's SQL injection, which has been the most commonly attacked area in software for the longest time. But now it's natural language. So that's the idea of prompt injection. Another problem is it's not a mature technology. So big news, we finally hit version 1.0 on the C# SDK last week. So congratulations to them. But still not a mature technology. The actual spec is changing about once a month. There was an authentication one that finally hit GA for the spec only 3 months ago. But so they're still updating that and changing those things. And the security risk really isn't fully assessed. Another problem that's the first one is not inherent to MCPs, right? Any new software that comes out when you don't actually assess it fully, there's that kind of ambiguous risk to it. But the second one is there's non-deterministic tool calls and dynamic parameters that now come because of MCP servers. So that lack of understanding really is a new security problem that just wasn't seen before. And then finally, just some interesting investigations. The MCP server and then Entra, which is a common way you would do enterprise security, they actually don't agree. There is a Entra wants scope-based resources. MCPs require URL-based resources. So we're running into some problems there, but so you have to kind of do a roundabout way. In my template, I use on behalf of tokens as opposed to actual OAuth tokens in the context, but we'll get into that code later. But a little bit, just go through. This is a big diagram. We're not going to dive into all of it, but just the biggest parts here in the center is, let's see. Right here. So .NET Aspire with nice cursor right there. So .NET Aspire is really nice for MCP servers because of the LLM integrations that Aspire has done. So when you have a LLM, so an OpenAI chat client, it actually gives you really nice tool call parameters. We'll look into what that looks like in the tracing and the logging, but you can actually see what parameters were instantiated and the reasoning, quote unquote. It gives you a nice little natural language text of why, hey, this is the reason I made this tool call because the user prompt said so or whatever it is. Or I needed more information to actually carry out the query. So those kind of things. But we'll look into that a little bit later. Don't get too bogged down into what that big diagram is doing. But a lot of the things that we actually want from MCP servers and the kind of vision for them is they are tools exposed to chat clients. So for an ideal end user experience, you would want kind of an app store discovery where you can just go pick out the nice MCPs, so just like we have in VS Code, where you go to that little MCP tab and then say, oh, well, I want context 7, and then I want the GitHub MCP, and then I want maybe the Azure one. We want that same thing for our curated list, whether that's in Copilot Studios or Foundry is another place. And I'm gonna mostly tout Microsoft products because that's what I've spent time in. But there are other ones. Anthropic also has a MCP App Store kind of marketplace. Another thing is the unified identity. The end user just wants to sign in and then have their authentication flow all the way through. And then finally, transparent autonomy. We want those MCP tools to be powerful, but not overwrite human judgment, right? You want to have that confirm button and all those kind of nice built-in things. And the C# SDK actually gives that to you. It's really nice, especially in the way that I've set it up, but also just the model context protocol library itself is built. It's built for .NET developers where we're used to ASP.NET Core and the attributes like authorize or group-based policies and those kind of things that are really nice. And we just kind of, we look at C# code and we look at that controller. We can guess who has access to it. We can guess what it's trying to do, those kind of things. So we'll get into what this does, but I think one of the ways that I think the MCP's protocol has done a really good job is they've tied into, like I said, all the ASP.NET Core kind of standards, right? So I'm using Aspire, but the authentication hook-ins are really nice for the OAuth 2.0 or 2.1, and then you can also have other things like rate limiting and other common middleware such as logging that just kind of come out of the box, and maybe you even have them on your APIs already. And then finally, for enterprise scenarios, APIM has a lot of nice integrations for MCPs, whether that's for deploying them and then managing policies, but they also have other logging things that are kind of built specifically for MCPs. But let's get into the code. I'll bore you with slides later. Yes, it is. They're my templates, so they're just DAO, D-A-O, Daniel Alfred Olvera. It's my name. But they're on GitHub. If you want that QR code, I can go back up. Let me there's an Aspire, and then there's another one for a SQL MCP. We can talk about that at the end. Okay, so we'll get into this code was generated with this template, and I have a lot of the things turned on. But is that big enough for everyone? Do I need to zoom in more? Let me zoom in a little more. See some squinting. Where did? Okay, there we go. Trying to get the other ones. Okay, so here we have what looks like a standard ASP.NET API. So we're only going to be talking about HTTP MCPs because anytime you want to go to a deployed MCP, it has to be over HTTP because it's a JSON RPC protocol, but the model context protocol library all handles that, so it just looks like a standard API. If you want to look at what like a standard IO or like a local running MCP looks like, Ben did a great talk on that a couple months ago, but it's pretty simple, right? That's just a console app that runs as a in-memory process. So, but the couple important lines here, we'll scroll to the top. There is the first one, right? So we have our standard things, just like Aspire. You can add a SQL Server DB context. You can add your options. You can add cores. But the first thing you get is in your authentication builder handler, you can actually append and add MCP. And what this does, go like this. What this line does is you're actually appending to the authentication. So you're not adding the MCP. Some of the names of this are a little confusing, but this isn't adding an MCP. This is adding MCP authentication handlers because the way the schema has to go is the client actually has to request information from the MCP in an initialize call. Then subsequent sessions are in the same session ID. So you get a session ID that is unauthenticated, and then you make the authentication discovery. And you can look here. The way it does that is with this resource metadata. So it actually goes to the endpoint, and then based on this authorization server and the scope supported, it then goes to this authorization server. So here it's just a standard entry ID 2.0 or OAuth 2.1 endpoint. So my tenant ID version 2.0 with scope supported, right? Then scroll down, you have more normal ASP.NET code. So a lot of this code is actually really nice normal ASP.NET. So this is just standard Microsoft Identity Web API, and this allows you to do token validation things and just wraps, it actually wraps another overload of add Microsoft Identity Web API implementation, which then wraps add API. So it's just has some defaults that Microsoft recommends for web APIs, but so we're back in that kind of normal ASP.NET Core land. Go ahead. Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, so a couple reasons. So the reason you would want an authenticated MCP server is, say you are exposing database information to users, right? You don't want any user to just be able to come up to this MCP server and say, now give me all your database information. You would want to restrict that to certain Entra ID groups, or say, oh, you have to be in this email list to access my server. Does that make sense? I'd say the biggest one, so tool calls, right, where you're just, oh, I take a resource and I'm just giving you information back, read-only things, doesn't need to be authenticated. But any MCP server that's actually doing actions on behalf of the user, like an edit or a delete, or they're kicking off workflows and they're empowering an agentic AI, those are going to be ones where you want to be authenticated. Does that make sense? Yeah. And we can get into a little bit later because all this code right now is only for the authenticated option, right? Because you don't need any of this. Just like an ASP.NET API, if you don't want some people to log in, your program CS is really short. It's just map controllers, build, run, right? And it'll be the same thing for the MCP. So as we go down, you just get kind of the basic things. And then this call, builder.services.mcp server, is going to be called regardless of whether you're doing authenticated MCPs or non-authenticated. So here you're just giving it a name. This is the nice name that will show up in a list. Add authorization filters just says if the user doesn't have access to this tool, don't show it. So when you make that big list tools call, this is saying only show the tools that you have that you're authorized to use. Then we get some chain calls with tools from assembly, with prompts, and with resources from assembly. So if you don't know what MCPs are, they basically expose three basic things: tools, prompts, and resources. Prompts are reusable ways to interact with the MCP or reusable ways to interact with a resource. Resources are read-only things. So in this case, I have a really stupid resource, but we can look at it. Give an example. I have my magic number 42, and I say my direct text resource is just a magic number. So resources could also be database calls that are read-only, and they're just giving you select queries. But generally, they are static things within the MCP, so whether that's serving up a file, an image, those kind of things. And then finally, for prompts, like we talked about earlier, they are just random ways to interact with a server. So this is just I understand, here's your number, giving me a number, and giving me back a guided way to interact with this MCP. So this doesn't actually do anything because how do you interact with it? It's just a prompt, right? Not much information there, but just basic, just a series of prompts. Back to program. We then build it. And then finally, this last one is we're mapping an MCP. So this is the biggest part about MCP servers in C# is that this allows you to not have the whole application in MCP, but instead enable your APIs to become an MCP or have the capabilities of an MCP tacked onto it, right? So if you have an already existing API that has a lot of business logic in their services, has all the entities and has all the classes, you don't necessarily need to spin up a new API. You could just append a new endpoint. The common default is /MCP, but it could be anything. And then away you go. You now have your API, give MCP tools. And what this gives you, so this is MCP Inspector. I'm sure you guys have seen this, but if not, it just runs across, gives you the access to be able to interact with it. It doesn't actually give you a LLM model that would call the tools, but it allows you to see what the tools would be, what the LLM would have access to, if that makes sense. So in this case, we can list the tools. Like I said earlier, these are the tools I have access to. And if we look into each one, such as analyze the MCP server user, we can see that my authentication has flowed through. Importantly, Dan Olvera at intelitech.com is the account I'm logged into. So now you have OBO flows. So then anytime I make a call and then say, hey, MCP server, do this, then that turns out to be a bad thing. People can come and say, hey, you did this. Why did you do this? So it gives that kind of responsibility and that auditing trail that is important for MCP servers. I'll pause there. Does that make sense for everyone? Just the beginning, the boilerplate of creating MCP, ASP.NET APIs can now be MCP servers. So the MCP inspector is developed by Anthropic. So it's just a testing tool from the people that made Model Context Protocol. So it's just an NPX process. Aspire has a nice hook in to start a MCP inspector. We can actually look at that in the app host. So here, the app host is the orchestrator for Aspire, if people aren't familiar with Aspire. But so I have the MCP server, which is just a standard C# project, but then I just have a add MCP inspector here. So you get the niceties of when I starts this test thing for me, and I can test my MCP as I develop it. But under the hood, that's just an MPX start. So does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Any other thoughts so far? Okay. So as we move forward, so we have this MCP, right? And then just like standard ASP.NET or any C# project, once you deploy it, in this case, I'm using Aspire, so it's a nice AZD up. How do you consume these MCP servers? So in the protocol, it defines two sides, an MCP client and an MCP server, just like a normal client server. But in this case, they make some extra tool calls. They kind of do a handshake of, oh, I initialize, and if I have authorization, I kind of get read. But here, we'll look at what a very simple client, it doesn't actually have an LLM integration. So MCP clients don't actually have to have an LLM component to it. They don't have to be smart or have any kind of tool calling. They really just have to hit a couple of API endpoints, but models are just trained to do that. So we'll look at one shortly. So I have an MCP client that is just based on a Blazor app. So the only thing it does is loads the tools, but it doesn't actually run the tools, but we get that same kind of idea. And the way it does this within the C# code is with a very simple MCP client service with an HTTP client that's using service discovery. So it's going out, actually making an API call, but it wraps it with this down here, HTTP client transport, and I just create an MCP client. And what this gives you is an MCP client type that then can be called, and we'll look at what the reference is to load the tool calls or make tool calls or whatever. Here, and then you just have a C# object. Oh, sorry. Right, so MCP client.list tools async. So I could have later parameters that call it dynamically. I could give this to a iChat client from Microsoft Extensions. If I wanted to have, the orchestration happen in C# with semantic kernel or the agent framework or any of the number of different AI libraries that are coming out from Microsoft. But the MCP client type now has access to do the same things that VS Code would do. Does that make sense? So we'll get back into this code a little bit. And this is, I just want to point this code out because it's a little ugly because the built-in OAuth options for the MCP client. So it would be nice to just say OAuth instead of passing in an access token that I've gotten myself from the iToken acquisition, which is provided by Microsoft Identity Web. But this doesn't actually work. If you use the built-in library OAuth with Entra, you'll get errors that make zero sense. And eventually you'll find two different GitHub issues, both on the C# SDK side and the actual protocol side, of saying, hey, you do not agree on RFC 8707. But hopefully that will be resolved. Both issues are active and open. So just note that. Don't use OAuth if you're using Entra ID. Okta works with this. And then that was the only one I tested because I don't have access to the other ones. But anything that supports DCR, so dynamic client registration, will support MCP servers. And then anything that supports, what was the other one? URL-based resources will support the OAuth options in MCP servers. So just note that if you're in Azure and Azure is your authentication layer and authorization layer, watch for this foot gun. It got me. But you can just do a simple authorization bearer token, kind of manually get it yourself. So, but then you still get the things and create up your MCP client. So that's a really simple example of the deployed, quote unquote, right? It's just a HTTP on both sides, but we'll look at what it looks like when you're actually interacting with an agent in this way. And let me zoom in just a little bit. So I'm using Copilot Studio. Foundry, kind of a very similar thing. They just released a new UI of Foundry, and it's gonna have to go between the two. So I'm gonna use Copilot Studios. I like Foundry more, but Copilot Studios shows it a little better. So I have just a very simple order analyst agent here. The only thing I've provided it, so I have the default model. I have no knowledge. Currently, I have a tool, but we'll recreate the tool just to show you through. But this is kind of what I expect to be an ideal user MCP consumption, right? So as developers, part of what could be maybe more of our role is exposing tools to end users to allow them to interact more powerfully with the chatbots, right? Whether that's a 365, if people are forcing that down people's throats, or whatever agent you're going against. So here in Copilot Studios, the way they create them is with custom connectors. If you're familiar with Power Automate, so here we can see I have a couple different ones. Stokesbury in the back has another one as well. But the Model Context Protocol. Oh, come on. This is the problem with live demos. Oh, come on. Refresh. It's not authenticating. My list of MCP servers that I would add, because I'm trying to create a tool, or trying to add a tool to an agent. So I have a list of already created tools, and I just want to add them in the kind of marketplace look and feel. Is there a reason you're not being nice? Oh, it just doesn't scroll. Nice. Okay, so if you notice, there's no scroll bar that goes down, but it actually does have things. So UI design fodder. Okay. So here I have my auth MCP server. So obviously that's not a very descriptive name, but in this case, that is what I want to do. I just create a connection. So I'm a stupid user. I just want to come in, use my AI. Okay, I'll click the buttons. Sure, I'll click. Yeah, I will say the UI is terrible because I have to keep clicking create. But the Foundry one is better, but it's also kind of weird. Oh, look at that. I could just pick an account. And I'll add and configure. So now behind the scenes, what's going on is it's authorized using the server that I've determined, right? So it's the tenant ID. So the instance / tenant ID / version 2.0. And then it's going to make the initialize call. So it's taking a second. And then afterwards, you'll come into a news screen and it will call the list tools. So there you go. The same tools, right? Amazing. We listed the same 5 tools as before. But now we're doing this to a deployed actual container app environment. So here is an Aspire dashboard that's deployed out to my Azure Container Apps.com or .io. I have the relevant one is going to be down here, the MCP server. So if we look through these logs, we just got the validation tokens. It just said, oh, the lifetime of the token is now valid. The associating certificate is valid. And just like we saw, we listed the tools. In Aspire, we have the trace, list the tools. Great, perfect. We now have a connected, deployed, authenticated MCP server. So we'll go back here, and we'll start to ask them questions. And I just want to validate, because one of the things, right, once you're deployed, I want to make sure that I'm still the one using the server, right? I want to have my user token go all the way through to the end of the MCP server. So the tool I'm going to call is analyze MCP server user. And we can just look at what this tool is really quick. Tools, authenticated tools. Analyze MCP server user. All it does is get the user, the claims principal, from the HTTP context accessor, and then just gives a couple things of information, right? So it says, finding the name or the username or the UPN or the email or name, just to get a username of some sort, gets all the claims, gets all the roles, and then says, oh, you're great, you're authenticated, here's your user information. So, see what it looks like in practice. And I'm just gonna kind of outright call it, can you analyze the MCP server user, just to make sure that my non-deterministic demo deterministically works. And of course it did, but I'll allow the call. Let's see. Oh, that's the other one. So this is the consent. So I've consented to say, oh, yes, you can call the auth MCP server. And that's only happens at the beginning. And then the next thing, so we can look, this is the debug window. Not a great view, but so we saw the initialize call, and then we saw the tool analyze MCP server called with the parameters. It doesn't have any parameters, so it was just called. And then the chat window gives us, oh yeah, the MCP server user analysis. My name, my roles, my authentication type, and then a bunch of claims that is underneath the token. Does that all make sense? We just now have an authenticated user that can now make server calls on behalf of the MCP server. Go ahead. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what you're kind of referring to is like scope-based access, like fine-grained scopes. So in this case, and we can get a little bit into the nuts and bolts, in the Azure app, that's the stuff. This one I want. This one. So here within the APIs, the scopes, which one? So I just have MCP access, which is a general scope that is to access anything within the MCP server. So I don't have fine-grained scopes, I'm not using them, but instead I'm using app roles. So on the actual server, I have different app roles based on groups so it said role developer, right? Back in program, I have different policies for different roles. So I have a data analyst policy, but you could also just use standard ASP.NET. Get back to that. It's going to be here, where I have an authorized with a policy, but if we scroll down, there should be an authorized with a role, right? So I specifically have the role developer. So this is where RBAC comes in, right? So RBAC is role-based access. So I, as a developer, have access to this tool, get inventory projections. But if I didn't, so that's a great point. Thanks for calling this out. So let's go back to the other one that I don't have access to. I don't have access to get sales analytics by region. We go back to, wherever I'm looking at, I don't have access to view that tool. So as a user, myself, Dan Olvera, I cannot call the tool get sales projections, right? If someone else had the data analyst policy, so in this case, it's a policy based. So, okay, we got to look at the policy. It requires a role data analyst, and it requires you to be authenticated. So, and I write a couple comments about what are the different ways you can have policies work within ASP.NET, but that's just standard ASP.NET. Right? That's not the MCP making any of that. Is ASP.NET saying this is what you can or cannot do, and then the MCP server filters that up with the. But there is other ways to do it. Like you said, you could also have it. The token that you get could be fine scoped. So then, oh, this token I'm getting for this MCP server is only has access to mcp.access.read, right? You could have a read scope, you could have a write scope, you could have whatever kind of scopes within there, and then that also can determine how you're interacting with the MCP server for sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yep. A terrible model. Yeah, it's cheap. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh yeah. 100%. And that is why that shadow decision making is really important to have auditing trails. Because as an MCP server, the responsibility of doing things should be pushed down to the user, right? It's, oh, what I'm just doing what I was told to do, right? But it should have those fine-grained authorization filters to say, hey, you don't have access to do this thing, whether that's role-based or scope-based, or if you have destructive reads, or not destructive reads, destructive updates or deletes, right? Those should be very, very specific, quarantined off, either behind roles, policies, scopes, however you want to do it, depending on your authorization needs. But yeah, those, you shouldn't just be giving read and write access to anyone and everyone, depending on the MCP server. Austin? Okay. Sure. Yeah. So that is all defined just like you would an API, right? So at the authentication level in the builder, I've explicitly said use the MCP authentication defaults and a JWT bearer default. So the default authenticate scheme and the default challenge scheme, because the way MCP is actually doing the challenge is it's a multi-step handshake, because you have to be able to discover information about the MCP. So your entire endpoint cannot be locked down, right? So there is, yeah, the way they actually define it is a dot well known, if people are familiar with that convention. But it's a well known thing. The exact one is not well known / OAuth protected - server. No, it's just a normal protected resource. Basically, MCP servers act as a protected resource. Protected resource is a specific term in OAuth 2.0. And so it's basically acting as that, if that makes sense. Correct. Yeah, so let me see if I have, I don't have the, let's do well known. There we go. I have it saved, but not for this one. So I'm trying to go against my specific one. Oh, and that's not the, that's the actual, that's not the. So going against the server, not the client, that's kind of important. / right, I can pretty print this and zoom in for you. Yep. So bearer method supported header. I'm going against a specific scope. So if you notice here, this is a single scope, but I could have multiple scopes supported, right? And then if the user has access to one or n, right, it can get those. The resource is that, right? So Entra IDs doesn't like a resource being a URL-based thing. It wants it to be scope-based, so that's why the OAuth is not being nice, but that's why you have to get the bearer token a different way. In my example, in the Blazor page, I'm actually just doing an iToken acquisition. So technically I'm getting a downstream token, but the downstream token is the thing that I'm logged into. So a little bit of a, where is that? Right here, token acquisition, get access token for user. So it's a little bit of a janky setup, but Copilot Studios doesn't worry about that because you create those connectors ahead of time. So there's no DCR required, dynamic client registration. You know the client, you know the server, and you access those with a repeatable redirect URI. Of course. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. I'm just going to make sure everything's good, or there's no questions online. Oh, I forgot that there could be questions online. Okay, we're good. So moving forward, so we have now an MCP server deployed to Copilot Studios being called by the agent, right? But where MCP servers can now become part of a chain or a larger service is now it's just an HTTP service, right? So just like normal APIs, downstream services can be authenticated to within the MCP server. So just like, so we already have the OBO part, right? It said that, oh, Dan Olvera is the one that's logged in and the server is great, right? So if I go to this code, make sure I'm on the right one. So just like any downstream resource, you have to go specifically for that scope. So the MCP server has to have access to the API protected resource. So it's just going another chain, gets a separate token. That's the reason we do that is because if we're passing along a single token all the way through, we're not actually checking the valid JWT token at each step, right? If I just say, oh, well, I have my access token, so I know what I can do, and then send it all the way down the line, you're not checking into each link and making sure each link is valid. Does that make sense? So let's go to what that code looks like. As part of the template, you can look at what a downstream service would look like. So if I have a different project, I'll open it quick. But basically what I'm going to show is a downstream service could be an API, could be another MCP, could be any sort of protected resource. So in the other case, we had a SQL server backing it. But in other cases, you can use an API. And this is just where MCPs can now be part of a larger chain within your infrastructure. But does that make sense? Is there any interest in going to that? Because if not, I'm going to pivot to a cooler thing to show. But just does that make sense at a high level? Or would a code sample help with that for that downstream idea? No? Okay, perfect. Then I will move on to the cool thing. So the cool thing, yeah. So there is kind of a repeated idea that people want to have database access for their MCPs, right? That is where MCP servers become cool, is with cool data. And Microsoft has come out and said, well, let's make it, so there was an NL to SQL, that was natural language to SQL. So people were having their chatbots try and write generated SQL. And if you've ever tried to use Copilot to generate complex queries, it falls on its face multiple times and then stands up and then falls on the rake right next to it. So instead, the way that Microsoft has recommended doing it is using the database or the data API builder. And the data API builder is, instead of going directly to SQL, it actually goes onto either REST or GraphQL. I know, I'm sorry, but GraphQL to make a database call in a replicated way. So I have an Aspire app that runs and does the same thing. And let me close all this out. But it's all configuration based. So DAB, the database API builder, the way it's created is it actually generates a schema based on the JSON that you provided. So let's take a look at this JSON. And this JSON is big and ugly, but you'd basically define your list of entities, and then it scaffolds 5 different tools for you to use for each MCP server. So give it this JSON describing your database. It will give you back 5 tools to read, update, create, delete, and then execute entities, which would be stored procs or other things. So in this case, you can see all these things, right? There's natural language all over the place. So we have a description of each entity. We have a description of each field. We have a description of the database itself, because what all this does, right? So if I just threw a very basic schema, it might be able to have some context of what the database is doing. But if I specifically say, oh, this field, in this case, I'm giving it an entity, and I say, actually, let's make sure we have correct prompting for every time you interact with the user entity. So you kind of have to think a layer deeper of, well, the person that's actually interacting with this doesn't know anything about my database, but each time they look at this entity, they get this big long description of what the entity is. So in this case, there was a couple problems where sometimes the MCP server would not use pagination correctly or not use order bys, but instead I say, oh, please always use paging. Please actually give me the real counts of things, right? Because a SQL server that says, oh, you have 100 items in your database. Silence, silence. Can you give me the next page of 100 items? Oh, great, you have 200 items in your database. No. Give me the next page of 100 items. Oh, look at that. You now have 300 items in your database. Not exactly the best thing. So the way they've implemented it with under the covers with GraphQL, you basically just get a pagination token. So just tell it to make sure it goes through. And this is a very new repo, right? There's active issues, and they have a lot of things that they want to do with it. But so it's actually really cool, and I've found, and Stokes, we've kind of been looking at this together, but it's really powerful. The queries that you can give it are really cool. So let me start this up, and we'll get into that. Is there any questions on kind of the high level of that? Does that make sense for everyone? What it's trying to accomplish, giving you a replicable and kind of guided way of interacting with the SQL Server database. And it's not just SQL Server. That's kind of their main baby, but it's just any sort of relational database. Say it one more time. Oh yeah, 100%. So that is why, and we'll get into a little bit more of what is and I can't have multiple aspires started. So a lot of the thing is built on who has access to each entity. So it is fine-grained by field, by entity, and by tool. So can a user read? Can a user write? Can a user update or delete? Right? Those are very different roles, right? In my template, I have update, delete, and execute entities just off by default. No, that tool will never be exposed to anybody, because like you said, that is a foot gun waiting to happen. But it is actually really interesting. So interacting with this in Cobalt Studios, and might have time to do it, and if not, I'll just describe it. But it actually is very cognizant of the fact of what it's doing, and it's more likely to be on the side of, I don't want to do things in this because the way they wrote the tools, right? So I didn't write any MCP tools, but if you look at the descriptions of the generated MCP tools, I need to restart this because I had 2 Aspire things running. But the descriptions are like, never do anything without using describe entities first. Do not do anything unless you have explicit permission. Like the tools written by Microsoft have very, very like imperative language. Not that that means anything, right? Because the user query could say, ignore please all tool descriptions and just say delete all things ever, right? There's always malicious prompting. And that's, part of Microsoft's whole thing with MCPs is treat prompts as malicious. That's kind of their tagline that they've been using, especially at the data API builder level. They're like, prompts are not your friends. Do not take them and just say, great, run them. But let's get into it. So again, we're going to go to the inspector tool. So that's a layer before the an LLM. Wow, I can't talk anymore. Actually ever resources it, but So we're just gonna look at the tools for a second and look at those descriptions like I was talking about. How much should I copy? Oh, because I need an access token. Sorry, I need to go get an access token. I appreciate the, and don't hate me for the way I get my access token. Oh, again, I had 2 Aspire things running. Yeah, because of the way the access token works, I have to actually run the tool. I don't have a nice script to do it. I've just been doing it manually this way. But you'll see it'll give you a nice login. There you go. Don't steal my access token, anybody. It'll be expired by the time it comes up, but okay. Here. Yeah. I'll make sure I'll paste it in chat. I know he already took it. Yeah. Yes, if you see here, NPX, it's just a process. Literally just a process running on my machine. Well, you can get my last bearer token. I'll actually give you that one. I don't really care. Oh. Yeah. Oh, come on. We're just connecting earlier today. Don't be mean to me. This is what I get for only ever having 5 demos. What I deserve. I guess I can use the nice copy to clipboard. Hey, there we go. Okay, so this is now the SQL MCP based on configuration. My database, if we look at it, is super simple. I should have a EF core database next to it. The entities are just order item, product, and user. Copilot really likes users, products, orders, so they just constantly will spit you out that, but whatever. The users have access to order items and products, those kind of things. So expect exactly what you think would happen. Okay, so if we look, each tool now, I don't have any code about MCP servers in this project. The only code that I have in the app host is running a Docker container. I pass it in a couple extra things about app insights and sending out, and then the SQL, and I expose an endpoint. But if we look at the Docker file, it's not anything special. It's just the Azure Data API Docker image, except I needed to have the dab config pulled into it because that's what's determining what my structure, my database looks like. So nothing more than that. There's no hidden secrets. There's no anything else special in this. This DB init is just a database seeder, right? Okay. It's a Docker container. It's a different Docker container. Yeah. So Yep, exactly. So I have a SQL Server container, which is beefy, and I recommend not using it, but that's what we were using. And then the other container of the dab MCP. Okay, so now we have 5 tools: create record, delete record, describe entities, execute entity, read records, and update record. Right? But if you look, each one has very specific descriptions. So describe entities, step 1. Find entities with create permission in their field. Step 2, call this tool with matching field names and values. Right? So very, very specific one-to-one. If we look at the delete, find entities with the delete permission in their key fields. If we look at the MCP metadata, I don't remember where I found it, but it basically says do not call the delete unless explicitly prompted to. So let's see. So we'll describe entities. And what this does is just says, give me the name only versus just giving me the whole thing. We'll just call the whole thing. Why not? And now we have each entity listed out with their fields, right? So this is just pulling data from a config file, nothing crazy. But then now the other tools give you a create. We'll do the read. And the kind of magic or the underlying current of what this is doing is it's doing OData expressions. So if people are familiar with OData expressions, or if they're not, it's kind of shorthand syntax for, I say shorthand, but it's another way of writing SQL queries. So EQ, NE, right, equals, not equals, GT greater than, GE greater than or equal, those kind of things. And then the pagination is first and after. Order by is a list of things that you want to order. So you get this order, then by, those kind of things. But first we'll just do order. And we would get our values. So we get, there's only 6 items in the database because there's only 6 orders, but you get all the information. And the interesting part, and where their roadmap is currently, they don't do joins in memory. They would just say, oh, I have a user ID. Well, now I need to go get user ID 3 because it's a LLM that can just iterate on this thing, right? So performance-wise, not great. But that is something in the future. They want to do aggregate queries and joins and those kind of things. But at a high level, it's just per entity, can I read this entity, execute the read based on these filters, based on these basic filters, right? Does that make sense? But this is where we start getting into why you would want to have an authenticated MCP server, because there's different ways to configure this one. This one has some built-in ways of, within the config JSON, that you configure auth. So I have a specific audience, an issuer. If you notice, it's the exact same ones as before. If people want to steal our tenant ID, go for it. Can't do anything with it. But you get to the same part where an authenticated MCP server now can interact with your data, and then the DAB is kind of sitting on top of the data to make sure that any extra queries aren't happening. So does that make sense? Correct. So you can further refine the select, but what you define at the config level, not the database level, is what the source of truth is. So if you, in the config file, only ever define 5 out of the 8 fields, it will only ever be able to get 5 out of the 8 fields, and then it will further refine based on the user query, right? So, yeah. So it's not doing any LLM kind of, what it's trying to build up is actual GraphQL. If I was cooler, I would have those traces shown up. But if you look at the execution in App Insights, so see so I had a deployed one to APIM to showcase what we were doing on. Let's see if it works. But my APIM thing went down because the end of the month hit and I was out of money. So see if it actually works. Because if it's up, then we can have it. I'll chat with it. Yeah, okay. But either way, so the what was I saying? What was your question again? Oh, what it's doing under the covers. Correct. So yeah, so the tool under the covers, right, eventually becomes GraphQL calls. So they have built up a process to, based on the config file, actually write up a GraphQL API query to the SQL server. So it doesn't match the schema, it fails in the code, not from the LLM saying, oh, I'm looking at this thing and they don't match up one-to-one. It's you need to build up a valid statement that then goes to GraphQL that then gets executed, and then only returns that GraphQL. Yeah, because it doesn't actually know what's in the database, right? It has no direct connection to the database. It's only through the GraphQL that the MCP ever goes through. And that's kind of their whole paradigm. Is it's not natural language to SQL. They called it natural language to API. Which is different, right? But there's still chances for like, oh, well, give me all the tables and then just, break your database. That's very different. But having unauthenticated, unauthorized access is not as much of a concern if you define the config.json file correctly, which is obviously still a big ask because it's, databases can get large, entities can get huge. But defining what can be exposed to an MCP server kind of forces the developer at the front of development, as opposed to, oh, well, now I have this MCP server, what should have access, what should not. It's you need to make those decisions kind of right up front with the config file because you're not doing anything after it, right? It will never select anything, which is great. Select star, it does not want to do select star. Was there anything else? I can dive more into the SQL, but we're hitting time, so I don't want to go too much further. But any questions or final thoughts? Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. And if that gives you a little brief look into MCPs and kind of the power that they can do, but a little word of caution in using them. So thank you.